So this earthquake, or these earthquakes, are what we would call shallow continental earthquakes. This means that they have broken the upper part of the Earth's crust down to about 15-20 kilometers. Beneath that, the rocks are too hot really to fail. And these are quite typical. This continental earthquakes going down to those kind of depths are what you typically see. The unusual aspect to this earthquake is that it's very large. So as well as going down 15-20 kilometers, it's gone along the ground by 200 kilometers or so. That area of rupture actually means that it's very large in terms of magnitude, and it means that the strong shaking has been distributed over a much wider area at the surface than would be typically seen, even in other large earthquakes. This is a notably large one. When earthquakes occur, it's typical to have aftershock sequences afterwards. So strong earthquakes will continue, smaller than the original one, but in the hours, weeks following. In this case, a second large earthquake in its own right, the magnitude 7.5 one, occurred some hours after the first one. And this is seen in other earthquakes, not always, but sometimes, that the first earthquake will change the forces and the stresses in the surrounding rocks. And then depending on how those stresses interact with surrounding faults, it can cause those faults to be triggered and to break in separate earthquakes. And that's what we've seen in here. So the first main shock, 7.8, and then some hours later, another large earthquake occurring. Technically, that's an aftershock of the first one. It's smaller than the first one, but it's a significant earthquake in its own right, with its own earthquake rupture. So the thing that's surprising is its size. I mean, it's not unprecedented within Turkey. There are historical earthquakes around Turkey and surrounding regions of equivalent size, but in this particular fault zone, the East Anatolian fault zone, there's a good historical record of past earthquakes. Typically, they have been smaller, though. I mean, still big earthquakes, right? Magnitude 7 to 7.5. This one is larger, and so that in itself is surprising. We're starting to learn more details about what actually happened in this earthquake. Scientists are already collecting data in the field, from satellites, from seismology, and we're finding that the rupture was quite complicated. It seems to have involved multiple fault segments, with the rupture jumping from one to the next, then the triggering of the second earthquake at a later time. So the complexity and the size are the things that scientists will be focusing on over the coming weeks, months, years to try and understand, and to apply those new knowledges to help understand what might happen in future earthquakes elsewhere. Just to say that it's in many ways a typical earthquake. It's just that it is very, very large. Right, so the magnitude of 7.8 is unusual. They happen, but it's amongst one of the largest continental earthquakes that we know. It's quite different from some of these, when you've seen in the news over the past years, earthquakes that occur along the edges of the oceans, where the source of those can be substantially different, right? You have these what are called subduction zone earthquakes. So one plate that's going down, and you have rupture over quite a big depth range, and the magnitudes of those earthquakes can be very large and can cause tsunami waves, etc. What we're looking at here is something that's within a continent. It's rupturing at a relatively shallow depth, 15 to 20 kilometers, but happened over a very long distance, and that's also contributing to the effects of the earthquake, because you end up with damage occurring over that long distance as well, which means this is contributes to this being such a damaging and very sad and tragic event. So there's two answers to that. One is when was the most recent time that such a large earthquake has occurred? I can think of examples in, for instance, Pakistan, but in places where there's relatively few people living. One of the things that we found here within this earthquake in Turkey, and it's affected large populations in Turkey, also in Syria as well, because there are so many people living there. And so we've seen such large effects, partly because of the population density. There's already some comparisons being made in terms of the size, the extent of the fault, the magnitude and the amounts of slip with earthquakes such as the San Francisco earthquake of just over 100 years ago, and also in terms of the population density. So, you know, it's that kind of size, it's that kind of area or population density in that kind of area over which we'd expect to see strong shaking.